All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first IGB DEI seminar for the semester. Since the IGB is at the U of I and we have active partnerships with Indigenous communities in North America, I will go ahead and read the IGB land acknowledgement. The Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology at the University of Illinois is on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. The IGB acknowledges the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of the University of Illinois for the past 150 years. We are obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Okay, so next, I am going to talk briefly about the IGB diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that we have going on since this is the very first talk. So I will share this with you. And so at the IGB, we have the Committee on Diversity that is currently working on diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives with the overall goal of creating a more welcoming and inclusive environment at the IGB. Most recently, the Committee on Diversity Task Force was created, and it is made up of individuals from the IGB community. And so it is open to everyone to share ideas and to help bring the Committee on Diversity's initiatives to light. And so I just want to give everyone a preview of what we have going on. In September, we have some exciting events coming up. And the first event is the Lunchbox series that was just recently funded by the Overseas DEI Broadening Inclusion Grant. The Lunchbox series is an event that will highlight the intersection between science, food, and culture, where we'll have campus chefs prepare dishes that will be paired with lectures from campus experts. So it's really exciting, and I encourage everyone to check it out. The other event that we have coming up in September is the Picture Scientist virtual screening. We will also have a Q&A with one of the directors of the film. So if you are interested in these events or more, please go to the link listed here. We also have task force meetings twice a month, bi-weekly. And so if you're interested in joining these meetings or to share your ideas or thoughts, please email us at cotf@illinois.edu. Our next meeting is to be decided, but if you sign up and email us, we can send you the time and date of our next meeting, which will be in September. All right, so now I am very happy to introduce today's speaker, Joy Ramp.
Hi.
Hello,
everyone. Hi.
Joy Ramp is a biocognitive neuroscientist, the vice president and co-founder of the International Alliance for Ability in Science, a nonprofit organization that provides resources, financial aid, and scholarships for student scientists with disabilities. Joey is also the CEO and the founder of Empower Ability Consulting, a firm that advocates for people with disabilities in STEM, with the focus on student service dog handlers in STEM. Ramp is an activist, renowned crusader, champion fighter for disabled student scientists, and the global pioneer for university-wide inclusive laboratory policies for student service dog handlers, providing them with equal access to science education. For her talk today, she wants you to know that exclusion for student service dog handlers and disabled students in general begins in undergraduate education with restrictions on core laboratory courses, and it becomes more challenging as these students consider graduate programs. There is a growing need for major science societies and science communities to adopt not only a climate and culture on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also access. Science communities are historically slower in adopting DEIA models. And so in her talk today, Joy will address this need and also talk in depth about the barriers to laboratory access for student service dog handlers, and finally discuss protocols for inclusion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joy.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here, and I want to share my screen here. So, being here, at my alma mater to give this talk is very important to me. This is where I started my journey, and so I am extremely passionate about this topic. A little history: I'm a survivor of a traumatic brain injury that resulted in really severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I experienced cognitive deficits. I had at one time lost verbal skills, long and short-term memory. It took nearly 8 years of recovery to regain a relatively normal life. And I did that with the assistance of my service dog. I've had 2 service dogs, and I credit them almost entirely for my success. And it took a lot of attention also to, for myself and to my environment and to how to manage my disability. But early on in my recovery, no one could really tell me what was happening in my own brain. And so I needed answers. That's when I decided to go back to college and study neuroscience so that I could kind of understand what was happening with myself and then potentially maybe help others. But to embark on a degree in neuroscience in my mid-40s, that's challenging, and that was challenging enough. But then doing so after becoming newly disabled made that task even more arduous. But the biggest obstacle I faced in my entire time in academics was not the coursework or the rigorous schedule of research, but the fact that I was a student with a disability and a service dog handler in science. So moving forward. There we go. I'm here really to talk about service dogs in science, and that's what I'm here to talk about, and the barriers handlers face, how we can start to provide just a more inclusive STEM culture, climate, and experience. I'm going to break this down a little bit today into a few different sections. I'm going to talk about some statistics surrounding STEM and disabilities in general, and then get into kind of the barriers that service dog handlers face, and then finally close with some solutions that we can focus on. So the National Institute of Health, NIH, and NSF have placed an extremely high priority on the cultivation of a diverse STEM workforce in the US. But based on some national reports, academics with disabilities are twice as likely to be employed in jobs within STEM fields only part-time, and are only half as likely to be employed in jobs in STEM fields in comparison to non-disabled peers. So this lack of representation of people with disabilities in STEM is kind of at odds with what the priorities of this stated research community are. Diversity and inclusion initiatives are really hot topics within educational institutions, and it's great to hear some of the progress that's happening, yet a lot of times there's a big disconnect between actually cultivating the diverse populations and also the actions of inclusion, because there's a kind of a gap, especially broad within STEM fields. It's not enough to recruit the students in with our words and our brochures and all of the things that we say at standing at a podium, but we also need to kind of actively provide a working and educational environment that retains and sustains them through these graduate programs. So diversity, equity, inclusion can mean a lot of different things. We could be talking about Indigenous populations. We can be talking about race, gender, LGBTQ+, low socioeconomic, rural populations. But what I'm here specifically to talk about today is disability diversity. And to narrow it down even further, talking specifically about disabled people who are assisted by a service dog and how science professionals can provide safe, laboratory access for these handlers. So why is this important? It is a fact. Student service dog handlers are being denied access to core laboratory coursework. And what I mean by that is your freshman gen chems, your general chemistry 1, 2, organic chemistry, general biology courses, nationwide and globally. And these core laboratory courses really prepare students for, a multitude of careers in STEM, not just biomedical sciences, but all kinds of different STEM careers, industries, and graduate work. So we need to really begin this very deliberate conversation on the issue of accessibility of science education to service dog handlers by removing unnecessary barriers. And I stress unnecessary. And I'll go into a little more detail as we go along, because these barriers really prohibit students from taking part in these core laboratory courses that are required to earn a degree in science fields. Which then thus, as a domino effect, creates the underrepresentation of individuals in science careers and in STEM, which again is counterproductive to the inclusive initiatives that the NIH and NSF are really stressing. So for me, in my own experience, I had a very successful previous career as an executive in research and development for a multi-million-dollar international corporation. It was my job to walk into a boardroom of very important, very powerful people and convince them to invest millions of dollars into my ideas, to put this into production, and then not only that, but then to problem solve and troubleshoot as I went. So I was very comfortable talking to people in powerful positions. But when I was even faced with the barriers of entering a lab with a service dog, I scrambled to really problem solve because I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what was needed to enter a laboratory initially. So I started trying to problem solve, and I was trying to navigate academics. I was trying to get good grades. I was managing a brand new disability. I was simply just in school trying to learn like everyone else. But because of the barriers I faced, I was forced to fight an academic system, in community college, in four-year universities, not just once to get into my freshman year. Every single semester was a step that just got a lot more complicated as I went along. So why is this important? The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that of all working age adults, about a quarter have some type of disability. US Department of Labor reports that 34.9% of the national workforce ages 18 to 64 is disabled. Only 2% of those employed adults with disabilities are STEM professionals. In 2019, a report came out by the Association of American Medical Colleges. It reported about 1,500 medical students in the US disclosed having a disability and requested formal accommodations. And that was only about 2.7% of the total number of students surveyed for this report. That represented a much lower percentage than seen in other undergraduate programs like business and humanities, which average about 11% of students who have disclosed having a disability. And one of the top reasons reported by the students in the medical college was that they did not report their disability out of a fear of judgment, bias, and a skewed perception of ability. In other words, people were putting their own limitations on people with disabilities without actually understanding what they're capable of doing. Oftentimes, people will say to me, well, maybe students with disabilities just aren't interested in pursuing STEM. That's not true. National Science Foundation in 2017 and 2016 US Department of Education reported people with disabilities are not underrepresented in STEM because they're not interested in studying the subjects. About a quarter of post-secondary undergraduate students majoring in STEM fields disclose having a disability. However, the proportion of graduate students with disabilities in STEM fields is less than half that at 11%, and the proportion of PhD recipients with disabilities are only at a little under 7%. So this suggests that relative to the other demographics, such as humanities and business, students with disabilities are just less likely to pursue a graduate education in STEM after their post-secondary experience. And the number one reason when I'm working with a student, a client, a disabled student, what they state, they feel unsupported by STEM faculty. And when I ask a person I'm working with, okay, what is your number one criteria for searching a graduate position or something you want to do in graduate research? They don't tell me what their dream is, what they came into school to study. Their response is almost unanimously that they would rather work with someone that they feel who will support them through their position. So instructors and faculty members play a key role in determining the climate, the culture, and the environment. Some faculty go as far as being very hostile or very indifferent to providing requested accommodations because science is highly competitive, and it's a very high stress environment. Oftentimes, it's kind of a little rigid in thinking, and students with disabilities are just generally discouraged from pursuing science by family members, by academic advisors, by mentors, by PIs, or they just choose to forego STEM altogether because of the obstacles that they have to face. So to obtain the goal of a diverse STEM workforce, we need to start prioritizing inclusion of people with disabilities in STEM and higher education. Again, like mentioned previously, not only to recruit them, but how do we sustain and retain them? And what we need to do is start developing the policies that are not just DEI in nature, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's great, but we need to include the A aspect of that, accessibility, because diverse does not always mean inclusive, and inclusive does not always mean accessible. So we need to start looking at the accessible piece and add that to all of our DEIA initiatives. So we could do that by development of inclusive and accessible lab policies. It's even more imperative given that students, there's been a steady increase in students registering for disability services on college campuses. Like, for example, from 1978, to 1993, enrollment of students with disabilities tripled from 3% to 9%. At the University of Illinois, in their Disability Resources and Educational Services, who are the pioneer for disability services in 1948, they registered 547 students in the fiscal year of 2017, which was a 28% increase from the year prior. And most of the students who registered for those services had non-visible disabilities. It is predicted among medical professionals due to COVID that more people will have developed disabling conditions, so these numbers will likely rise. There has been a steady increase in the use of service dogs nationwide as well. In 1900, the very first service dog was introduced to the United States. In 1976, the role of service dog expanded from the traditional guide dog that it was introduced in the 1900s to hearing dogs for the deaf. The expansion continued to dogs that assist with a variety of non-visible disabilities, such as seizure alert, diabetic alert, people on the autism spectrum in 2003. And then in 2016, dogs were included to be trained to assist with people who had PTSD. And although there's no real uniformed accrediting system, Assistance Dogs International, or ADI, is the leading program that they establish a minimum service dog standard and requirement. And ADI accredits a lot of the non-for-profit training programs. They reported that active service dog teams in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Asia more than doubled between 2013 to 2017. And we know that, this is just a fraction because there is no formal registration or licensing of service dogs. So there's really no way to accurately track the actual numbers of working teams in the United States. With this increase, though, the presence of service dogs for people with disabilities on college campuses and the increased placement of service dogs for a variety of different disabling conditions, universities are going to see a growing population of service dog handlers who want to be part of a strong STEM workforce post-graduation. So with this increase, accessibility for service dog handlers in science is an issue and something that we should be proactively working towards. I want to introduce you to a few people and provide kind of a hypothetical question. On the far left is Dr. Matt Hall. Dr. Matt Hall is the lead pediatric oncologist with the Miami Cancer Institute and Nicholas Children's Hospital in Miami, Florida. He was struggling to get through his residency because of his condition and had no independence, was reliant entirely on colleagues, friends, family, and he considered dropping out. And he was introduced to his very first service dog, Nona, who is pictured here. Nona goes to work with him every single day at the hospital. Hypothetically now, if Matt Hall, as a freshman entering a college and was absolutely barred from his very first chemistry course and was told that he could never have a career in biomedical sciences because he had a service dog, would we have Dr. Matt Hall working to support children who are battling cancer? In the middle here, we have Mark Rufinock. Mark Rufinock is one of the top forensic scientists. He is called in across the nation to come in and testify in criminal cases. He also is the founder of Dogs for Diabetics. He found out kind of later in life that dogs have a sort of innate ability to detect chemical changes in a person's body. They smell it, much like they would find explosives or drug dogs that work for police departments. He did a lot of research on it and discovered that this is something that can be actually trained into a dog. So again, hypothetically, if Mark Rufinock, as a freshman entering a college, was banned from his very first chemistry or biology course, would he be one of the top forensic scientists called in for criminal cases? And two, would he have developed a program that places service dogs free of charge to recipients in need? Mackie here on the right is an undergraduate veterinary technology student, or was, in Puerto Rico. She reached out to me in 2017. It was quite a battle to get her service dog allowed into the laboratory. We did. She has changed policies in Puerto Rico. She's now well on her way in veterinary medicine, and she is supported by her service dog. She battled a lot of battles that were very unnecessary. And then we have Theo and we have Samson, my service dogs. Theo was my very first service dog, who was also the first service dog to enter a chemical lab at the U of I in its 150-year history. Samson was the first service dog to enter a biology lab and also a research lab at the University of Illinois in its 150-year history. They are the pioneers for service dogs in science nationwide. They have worked in laboratories now for 11 years. And I could have never foreseen this, but I am now considered an expert in the field. I am often called in to testify or to speak on behalf of either students and or universities to try and establish, some sort of cohesive, copacetic kind of culture and environment that has a positive outcome. I advise universities in the development of inclusive policies. I help accommodate student service dog handlers. I help people with disabilities in science academics in the workplace. We frequently advocate and assist different students pro bono at no charge. We work with science industry to help develop inclusive environments. I have clients now and people I work with who are service dog handlers that are very successfully navigating science academics, teaching labs, some who are in nursing school doing clinicals, working in pharmacies. I most recently have been able to work with a very persistent student who's now working in a BSL-3 lab. So, I worked in labs for 11 years. I've been in a neuroscience research lab for 4 years, but what if I had given up in my very first year when my academic advisor, my freshman year, told me that I had to change my major, that a service dog would never be allowed in a laboratory? I didn't give up, and I wouldn't give up. Would I be here if I had listened to a professor who told me you will never have a career in neuroscience, so you might as well give up now because you have a service dog? I wouldn't be here talking with you today if that was the truth. Let me back up a little bit. So, my point is we need to really start working to overcome some of these barriers because people are being excluded who have a lot to offer, not only the community, to science, to the world in general. So I worked with the University of the Sciences, which is one of the leading pharmacy schools in the United States, in Philadelphia, and they were the very first university to develop a 7-page document of inclusive guidelines for accommodating service dog handlers in a lab. They went on to win a lot of awards for their initiative. And they have a student coming in the fall who has a service dog, and they are fully prepared to support that student because they were proactive in developing these guidelines. So since then, several universities have started developing these guidelines, and also the American Society for Microbiology, in their guidelines for biosafety and teaching laboratories, added guidelines for accommodating service animals in microbiology labs. So, to the people who say to me, people with service dogs just aren't seeking these opportunities in science labs. So, why do we care about it? My first reaction is, really? Because I get emails like this all the time. I'm currently in an anatomy class. I don't know what to do. No one at the university knows how to help me. How do we develop lab policies? I'm looking at resources because I'm taking my guide dog into my first class. I'm a medical student and I'm approaching my university. How can you help me? These emails come into me daily. Sadly, they're the ones that kind of break my heart. The stories I hear after the fact, where I can't change anything. Halfway through a class, they're asked to leave because their service dog is quietly doing their job, laying under a bench, and they weren't noticed when they first came in. The one that breaks my heart, one of the truest ones, is my daughter had a 3.9 GPA in her last semester. She was denied access multiple times to a lab class. She dropped out of class and she dropped out of college. Her last semester as a veterinary, working in veterinary medicine, with a 3.9 GPA. Because of a barrier that we could have easily solved, she has dropped out of college completely. It was too hard on her, and the barrier itself is what presented her disability to a point where she couldn't manage it anymore. Her service dog was helping her throughout her entire college career. Her very last semester, they were not. And we lost this person, very talented person in STEM, because of an unnecessary barrier. So what are the barriers? What are we looking at here? Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, Section 50 and Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, they do protect the rights of people with service dogs to enter areas that are open to the public. They do not identify specific training or require registration of a service dog. So the federal laws that protect people with service animals to enter public educational facilities are outlined in Title II and Title III. In one area in academic adjustments, it states specifically that a college or university which receives federal funding may not impose upon handicapped students other rules such as the prohibition of, and it specifically mentions guide dogs in campus buildings that have the effect of limiting the participation of the handicapped student in the institution's educational program or activity. But it also in the same area, it kind of says that if it fundamentally alters the nature of the work or causes a financial hardship, then they can be excluded. Now, these laws and policies that govern universities are ambiguous enough to leave room for individualization of accommodations, which we want. However, this also permits individuals, faculty members, administrators, whomever, to interpret the policies in a way that is not really objective. In addition, legal loopholes have opened the door for the general public to misrepresent a dog or as an emotional support animal as a trained service dog. I understand this is a problem. It's a problem not only for universities and businesses, it is also a problem for legitimate service dog handlers. So university service dog policies, though, and guidelines, especially in respect to laboratory coursework, either doesn't exist or it's really complex or is very ambiguous, which again leaves room for a very subjective nature of interpretation. And one of the largest hurdles for service dog handlers in science is the lack of more specific guidelines within the university policies on how to make inclusive environments in laboratories. A lot of students are advocating for themselves, and they're trying to maneuver oftentimes systemic bias, academic bureaucracy, tenured hierarchy. It's daunting. If you're 18, 19, 20 years old, it's a lot. I went in my 40s and was comfortable, addressing these things, but even then it was a lot. It was a lot to manage. So, the exclusion of service dog handlers begins in the undergraduate education with restrictions on these core lab courses that are needed. And although a service dog is considered medical equipment and it is protected under federal law, many times just the presence of the service dog itself presents the barrier for the handler. And that is based basically on kind of implicit bias of the person in charge. Now, implicit bias is human nature, but based on an uninformed judgment is when it gets a lot more difficult. So the absence of these guidelines really leaves room for individual interpretation. And sometimes faculty members just err on the side of caution. They default to personal opinion. They don't have time to deal with a problem, or, and they prohibit the service dog handler from accessing these experiences. So kind of the crux of this is that a lot of academic service dog policies don't address lab access at all, or the policies outline exclusion. For instance, any area that a person has to wear personal protective equipment, a service dog is not allowed. Some mention exceptions and case-by-case determinations, but don't provide the guidelines for making these determinations. So how is a lab manager really going to understand what a service dog is capable of? Some administrators are just reluctant to allow service dogs into labs based on, one, a lack of information regarding what the service dog's function and training is, or a lack of understanding of service dog laws. My most frequent question is, well, what if someone's allergic? Well, that's covered in like the top 10 things. If you Googled it, facts on service dogs that are covered under ADA. There's also this absence of guidelines to help establish these case-by-case determinations. But regardless of the complications, per the ADA, a service dog handler cannot be denied access or discriminated against based on personal judgment or prejudice. And by prohibiting the service dog from entering a lab or research lab without justification is potentially discriminatory and can have a lot of legal ramifications. So we need to establish the informed protocols, laws, and policies, clearly outline informed guidelines, and these need to be developed with people who are familiar with service dog training, developed with people who are familiar with disability in general, and the handler themselves because they know exactly what they need. So what are some of the solutions? We need to, one, establish, again, and I've said this like 5 times, establish an informed university-wide service dog policy for inclusion into science labs. And we need to develop those informed guidelines for case-by-case determinations. And we can require a service dog to wear the same personal protective equipment as the student on a given day: goggles, boots, lab coat, clean room suit, whatever is needed. If the student wears goggles, the dog should wear goggles. If the student doesn't wear goggles, the dog should not have to wear goggles. The exception to that is often people say, well, I don't have to wear gloves, so my dog doesn't have to wear boots. No, boots do not equal gloves. Boots are shoes. So we look, different laboratory hazards. We have to look at that. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services outline in chemical environments, chemical levels labeled A, B, C, and D, with D being lowest level of risk. Most general inorganic chemistry courses are considered level C, which do require chemical resistant gloves, shoes, clothing, and eye protection. And as you saw from the previous slide, a service dog can safely be accommodated in a level C or D chemical lab. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention outline laboratory biosafety levels as BSL 1, 2, 3, and 4, with BSL 1 being lowest level of risk, BSL 1 being lowest level of risk, excuse me. And BSL 1 category are the level of most core biology courses. BSL 2, gets a little more complicated and should require a risk assessment, but can oftentimes still be accommodated because they do require a lot of the same personal protective equipment as a BSL 1 lab. So as you see, a service dog handler and service dog can safely be accommodated in a BSL 1 and many BSL 2 environments. And we've already covered access for all of the basic labs in science undergraduate coursework. So there should not be, bans, bars, restrictions from entering core lab courses, but there are some exceptions, which I will get into here shortly. A lot of people say, well, you're just advocating for service dogs in all labs. Every person with a service dog should be allowed in every lab. That is not true either. Not all labs are safe environments for a service dog. BSL 3 labs would require risk assessment. As I mentioned, there is a student that I worked with who is now in a BSL 3 lab. After a very strict risk assessment, we deemed it to be safe, and they are being very successful in that lab environment. BSL 4 lab, on the other hand, full body air supplied positive pressure suit. I'm not going to say never, because it's possible. And the next slide, I'll show you a video of why that I believe that is possible, maybe in the future. One of the most common questions is, well, how would a service dog assist anybody in that type of lab? Well, a lot of times someone in a wheelchair will harness their service dog to simply pull the wheelchair so that they can use both hands. So in this environment, using both hands would be important. Is it possible to develop a full body air supplied positive pressure suit for a service dog to harness to someone so that they could work in a BSL 4 lab? Maybe. It's possible. I'm not going to say never. So I'm going to show a little video here. I'm going to have to move it forward a bit. And this is one of the reasons why I believe it is potentially possible. This is what they consider a clean room suit. A service dog or a working dog will use this particular suit in an environment where they go in to inspect for mold.
The depict is to show you that these animals can be trained to work just as effectively in the suit and mask as without it. In the beginning, we had a hit on this plant without the suit, and she's starting to hit at it again. That's why the suit has the tail part of it to give us cues. It looks like it's from the plant. The water's run behind the couch. So she's on it. Good girl. Good girl.
And lastly, Brett, what do you want people to know about iSpy?
So as you can see, technology is advancing, and I'm currently working with the patent owner and the inventor of the clean room suit, and we're in discussions in development of a less constrictive, more functional service dog lab suit that will provide protection in a lot of the core courses. Can that be developed and further developed for a BSL-4 lab? It's possible. That's why I will never say never on that one.
We have our own lab.
So we talk also reasonable accommodations. What does that even mean? Just in general, reasonable accommodations. Practical work in a lab is an invaluable part of science education. Lab experience involves a lot of unique hazards, different risk levels. They vary from lab to lab. So an individualized risk assessment is common practice for identifying accommodations specific to students' disability. And that's across the board. That's not just in labs, that's across the board in any environment, even classrooms. And an individualized risk assessment is provided for all students with disabilities, including those with service dogs. And it's a reasonable accommodation, which is tailored to an individual student's needs to allow equal access to higher education, as which is in section 504. Laboratory settings also require very specific accommodations, which are laboratory specific for their hazards. So when I do a risk assessment, I look at the arrangement of the room. How is the room arranged? Can we adjust floor traffic in any way? Is it accessible for someone in a wheelchair who has a service dog working alongside them? I always review the room for mobility access to make sure that there is not going to be any kind of tripping hazard or potential hazard. And then, especially in classroom environments, can we move the lab? When we have a general chem lab in one lab and it's maybe not quite as accessible as the one next door, can we easily move that lab? That's a reasonable accommodation that happens quite frequently just in classrooms. I identify accessible workstations or eyewash stations or areas so that maybe the person with the service dog doesn't have to traverse across a very busy lab, especially in student labs where you have 28 or 30 students all packed into one room in an organic chemistry course. Also, a reasonable accommodation is to set up reagents and equipment close to the workstation, again, so you minimize traffic across the lab. Also, accommodating service dog handlers in core labs oftentimes requires minimal to no change at all. It's always this big scary monster when I first start talking to people about, oh my gosh, we've got a dog coming into my lab. This isn't going to work. I don't know how I'm going to make it work. And then by the time we get, have discussions and they see what's happening, I generally get emails back and say, I didn't even notice there was actually really no change to anything that we did. So it would be really wise, again, to develop and publish and distribute these university-wide policies that provide guidelines for people so they kind of understand what is expected and what the picture is really going to look like. Another thing that you should always do is discuss positioning of the service dog with the handler. Many times these discussions take place behind closed doors and the handler is not even included in the discussion. Handler knows what their dog is capable of doing. You need to identify the bench where a service dog can potentially rest without chemicals directly above them. It's easy if there's not a recessed bench to move a table in at the end of an IOA that the dog can rest under so that there's, again, nothing directly above them. Also, placement is very important. Opposite side of the fume hood, if possible. If you're going to be working at the fume hood, make sure that they have a recessed area or something close that they can lay, below bench level. Also, you want to have them beside or behind the handler so that the dog can always have direct line of sight to their handler. Oftentimes, Samson will be across the room from me under a recessed bench area, but he is always in direct line of sight of me. You can request a volunteer lab partner willing to retrieve reagents and things, but only if the handler requests this. Now, the exception to that is some handlers can be separated for short amounts of time from their service dog when they feel comfortable with their own disability. And, maybe that's the time to start talking about having the service dog rest in a nearby office or somewhere where they can remain undisturbed. But that would be the decision solely on the handler and whether they are comfortable in that particular day. And there may be one day where they're not comfortable and the next day that they are, because they are managing their own disability. So we can provide a checklist for suggested skills. Say, for instance, although, faculty can ask a handler what specific tasks a service dog can perform. For instance, if someone says, legal questions, is your dog a service dog for a disability? My answer is yes. What tasks is your dog trained to perform? And I say, balance and brace, medical alert. That's all the information I have to give. So even though you're requiring this checklist, it's you can't ask the handler to have the dog demonstrate skills and tasks. What you can do, though, is watch the behavior of the dog once it is in your lab. If the dog is disruptive, is seeking attention, is not remaining in its place, is not actively doing something to help someone with a disability, is causing some disruption, is barking, any of those reasons are legal reasons to ask a handler to remove their dog. But if the dog is actually working and doing the skills that they are trained to do, and doing everything to help the student, then you can be pretty confident that that's a trained dog. But a skill checklist could be provided to the student when they're registered. This could be listed on a syllabus. This gives the student the opportunity to train their dog for the skills that they need to wear goggles or boots or whatever so they can be successful. And the skill set could include things like identifying the appropriate PPE, safe placement for the service dog at a downstay, out of the way of traffic under a recessed bench, lying on a mat for up to 4 hours, or getting into a safety shower, being conditioned for emergency situations, using an alternative alert other than nudging the handler, and not automatically retrieving dropped items from, say, a lab floor. And if the service dog is performing a disability-related task that requires them to move from one place to another, the service dog handler must be in control of the dog, but that does not mean that the dog has to be leashed. So some of the solutions: provide staff and administrators, faculty facilities, informational, maybe training videos or resources to include how to appropriately interact with the service dog team, not to interact directly with the dog, the do's and the don'ts kind of thing. Information on service dog training. What does that really look like? Is it a 2-week process, or is it a 2-year or 4-year process, which is more traditional for service dogs? Information on laws, policies, and guidelines, and accommodating them in a handler in a laboratory. We can incorporate these into, we all have to do, different types of, accreditations and credentials and do all types of different, can't think of the name, but we don't want to add any more to anyone's plate, but we can incorporate some of this information into the already existing things that we have to do. Research. Significant barrier for service dog handlers in core courses and graduate work are animal research labs. Currently, service dogs are prohibited from animal facilities on all campuses and around the country. It's based on the prey-predator paradigm. I am interested to find out if there is an effect. Definitely more research needs to be done to find out if the presence of a service dog has an effect on rodent physiology and behavior in moving forward. So we need to standardize university service dog policies to include service dog handlers in core courses with lab components by developing laboratory safety guidelines for service dog handlers. Develop these guidelines with an informed source familiar with service dogs and familiar with science. Develop a skills checklist for student service dog handlers so that they know what their dog is expected to know going into a lab to be successful. and you can require them to wear the same PPE as a student on a given day. We also want to remove the potential for a personal and implicit bias by providing service dog etiquette training material, video, supplemental material to administrators, faculty, facilities, and students. We can develop this material, again, with an informed source, service dog training organization, for example, or and develop the university safety guidelines for inclusion, not exclusion, inclusion of service dog handlers in lab environments. Again, research. We need to provide some empirical data regarding the effect of a service dog on rodent physiology and behavior. We need to focus on core lab courses first, but we do need, this is a piece that I get asked often. If there's no effect or minimal effect, that would provide the data and basis for inclusion of a service dog in some teaching rodent research labs. If there's a striking effect, that would provide the data for exclusion of service dogs in teaching rodent research labs. But either way, having this research done potentially minimizes the possibility of personal bias, effectively provides more solid guidelines that could be designed objectively, and develop solid guidelines, objectively based on data. So bottom line, we are accommodating the student service dog handler, not the service dog. The safety of the service dog falls solely on the handler, barring glaring negligence on the part of an institution. And the fact that accommodations are being made for the student and not for the service dog always have to remain at the forefront of all discussions. Ultimately, the safety of the service dog does fall on the handler, not the facility, not the faculty or the institution, again, barring glaring negligence. Oftentimes students are faced with barriers or adversity, and if accommodations aren't being met, they try to just suck it up and make it. And that not only sets them up for failure, but it also puts them and their service dog at risk, which would be an example of negligence on the part of the institution. So by protecting service dogs with safety guidelines in laboratories, it minimizes accident liability. It proactively developing these guidelines minimizes the potential for discrimination complaints and legal action. It improves university recruitment of diverse populations, disability handlers, student service dog handlers, and it also improves the workforce recruitment of talented STEM professionals who we don't want to lose. So bottom line, there are going to be more service dog handlers in our communities, in our campuses, in our workplaces. These individuals are protected by the ADA. And while laboratory safety is considerably, or is understandably a concern, and there's not a one size fits all way to accommodate individuals with service dogs in lab settings, the topic really deserves more nuance and to keep at the forefront the ultimate goal of ensuring the civil rights of the individual with a disability. And universities and employers need to be proactive in developing safety guidelines for service dog handlers in STEM. And there are proven solutions, and they're currently available. And yes, more research needs to be done in areas such as rodent research labs. There's a lot of work to be done. The work really requires a willingness from science professionals to cooperate, problem solve through communication rather than just defer to what's been done, defer to tradition, subjective interpretation, vague policies, or just an unwillingness to take the time to change. There's nearly a century-long history showing the efficacy of a service dog, providing independence and medical assistance for people with disabilities. This in conjunction with the documented increase in the enrollment of students with disabilities in post-secondary education and the documented increase in placement of service dogs to people with a wider variety of disabilities illustrates that it's time we take a hard look at accessibility options and inclusion policies for service dogs. So in closing, I want to say in 1948, people in wheelchairs were not allowed on college campuses or allowed to take college courses. In 2010, service dogs were not allowed to assist a person with a disability in laboratories. times are changing. And I spoke with a compliance officer for a major international pharmaceutical company not long ago who said, 20 years ago, we were pipetting my mouth. He says, in 20 years, I believe that people won't even realize service dogs were not allowed in laboratories. And that's my hope. Because of my service dog, I've been able to recover from a brain injury, get a degree in neuroscience, graduate with high distinction in research, start my own company, and ultimately advocate for other service dog handlers in science and make policy changes on a global scale to make STEM accessible. So for those of you out there who are either currently science professionals or will be in the future, change is happening, and it is up to you to be on the right side of history. We can be the change. You can be the change. You can make the difference in someone's life. You can make the difference in making science more accessible to all. So I ask you all to please be that change. Thank you so much. I do have a little video of Samson. If y'all want to see it here. Here we go. Oh, maybe.
Ultimate goal of ensuring the civil rights of the individual with disability. Universities and employers, they need to be proactive in developing these safety guidelines. There are proven solutions currently available to provide reasonable accommodations.
Of course, service dogs were not allowed in the laboratories, especially in the scientific laboratories. But after his persistent efforts to change this policy, Samson is now the first service dog to gain access to a biology laboratory at the University of Illinois and has sparked a policy change nationwide.
So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being interested. And does anyone have questions for me?
I have a question. I would like to know, how do people train service dogs to work in a lab facility? What is the time period? Does the department or the unit take the responsibility? Do we get some training? Could you discuss those background details with us?
Yes, well, that's a multifaceted question that I could give presentations on the entire thing, but service dogs generally go through, like Samson, for instance, went through 2 years of training. I actually met him when he was 18 months old. He was trained from the time he was 8 weeks old by a professional training organization called Paws Giving Independence out of Peoria, Illinois. And he was placed with me, but we knew, because he was my successor dog to a dog who had already been working in labs, that Samson had to be comfortable working in a laboratory. So I spent 9 additional months working with him because his training hadn't fully been completed. He normally would have trained for 2 years or a little bit more before being placed with someone. He was placed with me at 18 months, and I worked with him for 9 months to ensure that he was comfortable and safe working with boots and goggles and a lab coat, and that he could do what I needed him to do. In general, someone who has a service dog that they have been actively working with for years, it all depends on the dog, how quickly they are willing to learn how to wear boots and goggles and a lab coat. But that is why having the guidelines in place, a student would understand that their dog would need to do that, and therefore they would take the time to train the dog. It's unreasonable for someone to get into, sign up for a class. Week before a class, they say, oh, your dog has to wear goggles, boots, and a lab coat, and expect that dog to be successful, putting all of this extra additional equipment on and still effectively helping a person with a disability. So by having some information ahead of time that sets handlers and service dogs up to be successful because they can take the time to actively train. It does not fall on the responsibility of the institution to make sure that the service dog is trained. That falls on the handler. At the same time, we want to make every effort to ensure that that student has the opportunity to train their dog, to be successful, and to have that access. And again, like I mentioned, once the dog gets into the lab, then whoever the faculty, TA, whoever's running the lab, they can observe the dog in the beginning to see if their behavior matches what would be considered training. Are they staying in a downstay? Are they staying under a bench? Alerting to a disability or helping someone with a disability often looks different, but just having a basic understanding would come from maybe some informational, like I mentioned, informational videos that could be provided in some of the accreditations and credentials that we have to go through to work in labs, to do research or whatever. So, providing that information ahead of time, developing some of these things, developing a policy that's already in place that could be handed to a faculty member so they can read it and say, okay, I understand now what the dog is supposed to do. I understand what my responsibilities are, and I understand now how I can help the student. So, that's a fine balance. No, it is not the institution's responsibility to train the dog, but to help provide the student with the tools they need to be successful does fall, I believe, on the institution in helping that student through maybe disability services, by being developed through science faculty. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I have a question as a chemistry professor.
Yes.
I understand the accommodations are for the handler. I'm wondering what training the dog specifically needs to keep the dog safe in the event that someone else in the lab, let's say, spills a caustic acid on them, even though they're wearing PPE. If a student had PPE and somebody spilled something on, we'd send them over to the safety shower, take the lab coat off so we could get right to the skin to clean it. Is the dog trained to bark or give some sort of signal if, let's say, a student at the bench behind them spills something on them?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, it would be kind of the same thing if a student were, working at a bench and someone was working behind them and spilled acid on their coat. The person working may not even know it unless the student who spilled it said, hey, I just spilled acid on your coat. You need to go to the safety shower. You know what I mean? So it's awareness. We would hope that if someone were to spill something either on the floor, we would want them to notify someone to clean it up, right? So if they spill something on the dog, we would hope that they would say, hey, something got spilled on this dog. We need to help the dog into the safety shower. And that's one of the skills that can be included in the skill set, is that the dog has to be able to enter and stand in a safety shower, which Samson will do. We trained for that. Yeah, I trained it on one aspect at home, and we did some training in the lab as well, and that was a very stinky process, but we did, and he was very accepting of it. So that's kind of one of those situations where we can't impose something different on the dog that we wouldn't expect from someone else, from a human.
Right.
So
right.
if someone spilled something on me behind me and I didn't know it, I would hope that person would tell me so that I could safely get to a shower. If that person spilled something on my dog, I would hope they would say, hey, I just spilled acid on your dog. We need to get him to the safety shower.
Thank you.
If I see it, then, we can definitely notify someone and get that taken care of.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, let's all thank Joey once again for that great talk.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you again.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I would be glad to talk to anyone individually if something comes up along the way.